Hi, I'm David. I once watched a 4-star Admiral, a man in charge of a billion-dollar aircraft carrier, scoff at my 12-year-old son during a red alert situation. The most advanced radar system in the world was dead, and my team of elite engineers was completely stumped. The Admiral looked at my boy, Leo, as if he were a piece of misplaced luggage. Little did he know, the lives of all 5,000 souls on that ship depended on what that quiet kid was about to say. Have you ever felt completely invisible in a room full of experts, even when you were the only one who saw the real problem? Before I tell you how my son used nothing but his own senses to pinpoint a microscopic flaw that no diagnostic tool could ever find, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and please subscribe to the channel. Believe me when I say you are not going to want to miss the look on that Admiral's face when the radar screens, which had been dark for 6 agonizing hours, suddenly blinked back to life, revealing an ambush that was closing in on us fast. It was a moment that changed everything. The storm outside was relentless, throwing the USS Vigilance around like a toy. But inside the Combat Information Center, the real storm was one of controlled panic. We were operating under complete radio silence, deep in the North Atlantic, shadowing a rival fleet, and our eyes, the SPY-6 Advanced Radar Array, were gone. The screens were just dead, black voids. Every sailor in that room, from the junior officers to Admiral Thompson himself, felt naked and exposed. The air was thick with the smell of hot electronics and failure. My failure. As the lead civilian engineer, the responsibility for that silent, useless heap of technology rested squarely on my shoulders. Admiral Thompson stood like a statue carved from granite, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the main tactical display, as if his sheer will could force it to work. He was a man who lived and breathed protocol, a commander whose entire career was built on order and control. And in his world, there were 2 things that didn't belong in the CIC during a crisis: failure and a child. My son, Leo, was a quiet presence in the corner, only on board because of a last-minute family emergency. To Thompson, Leo's presence was a breach of discipline, a constant, irritating reminder that things were not as they should be, and he made no effort to hide his disdain. I wanted Leo to disappear. I felt this hot wave of shame every time the Admiral's cold eyes flickered towards him. My team and I had been working for 6 hours straight, running every diagnostic, cross-referencing every schematic, swapping out entire modules. We were the best in the business, and we were failing. The naval technicians, proud and defensive, were snapping at each other, their frustration boiling over. And through it all, Leo just stood there watching. He wasn't scared or bored. He was listening. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes unfocused, as if he was hearing a sound that no one else could, a discordant note in the ship's steady hum. The final diagnostic report came back. Hardware failure of unknown origin. Impossible to repair at sea. I felt my stomach drop. That was it. We were officially blind. I could see the decision forming on Admiral Thompson's face. A full-speed retreat. It was the only logical option left, but it was also a humiliating defeat that would leave our entire carrier group vulnerable. He was about to give the order, his voice low and strained, when a small, clear voice cut through the tension in the room. It was Leo. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes fixed on a specific power conduit panel. "It's not broken," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's just out of tune." The Admiral didn't just dismiss him. He laughed. It wasn't a loud, hearty laugh, but a short, sharp, ugly sound that cut through the CIC's tension like a shard of glass. "Out of tune?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he turned to me. "Is this some kind of joke, Caldwell? Your team of MIT-educated engineers can't fix my billion-dollar radar, but your son thinks he can tune it like a piano." The other engineers, who had been staring in disbelief, took their cue from him. A few of them snickered, shaking their heads and turning back to their consoles, as if the momentary distraction was too absurd to even acknowledge. I felt my face burn with a humiliation so intense it was almost physical. One of my counterparts, a senior naval engineer named Commander Evans, stepped forward. He was a good man, but proud, and our professional rivalry was always simmering just below the surface. He crouched down to Leo's level, but his tone was anything but gentle. "Son, we appreciate the input," he said, the word input sounding like an insult. but we're dealing with shielded plasma conduits and phase array amplifiers. It's a little more complex than the wiring on your video games. Why don't you let the adults handle this?" He patted Leo on the shoulder in a gesture of condescending dismissal, and then looked at me, his eyes saying, "Get your kid out of here. Now." Every word was a public condemnation of my failure, both as an engineer and as a father. Admiral Thompson's gaze shifted from Leo back to me, and the mock amusement was gone, replaced by cold fury. "Caldwell, this is the Combat Information Center of a nuclear aircraft carrier on high alert, not a bring your child to work day. Your team has failed, and now you are allowing this circus to unfold on my watch. Get him out of here. I need solutions, not fairy tales from a boy who should be in bed." The command was absolute. It wasn't just an order. It was a public stripping of my authority. In that moment, in front of my own team and the ship's command crew, I was reduced to nothing more than the irresponsible father of a disruptive child. I opened my mouth to apologize, to grab Leo and retreat, but my son spoke again. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't cry. He just looked past Commander Evans directly at the main power conduit panel near the tactical plotting table. "It's the crystal," Leo said, his voice as calm as the dead radar screens. "The harmonic frequency of the main power conduit is wrong. It's causing a resonance cascade that's cancelling out the signal before it even forms. It's like two waves hitting each other and becoming flat. You can't see the break, because there isn't one. The parts are fighting each other." The technical terms coming from a 12-year-old sounded so outlandish that another engineer actually let out a short, bitter laugh. "Resonance cascade? Did you get that from a sci-fi movie, kid?" he muttered, not bothering to keep his voice down. The Admiral was about to have Leo physically removed. I saw his hand signal to the Marine Guard standing by the hatchway. The air crackled with the impending, humiliating conclusion to this nightmare. But then a voice from the back of the room cut in. It was a young petty officer, no older than 20. I'd seen him earlier, frantically swapping out diagnostic cards, his face pale with stress. "Admiral," he said, his voice trembling slightly but clear. "Sir, with all due respect, what do we have to lose? We've done everything by the book, and the book is wrong. We're blind. Anything is better than nothing." He didn't look at Leo. He looked at the dead screens, his words born not of belief in my son, but of pure, unadulterated desperation. A heavy silence fell over the CIC. The petty officer's desperate logic was a stark, undeniable truth that hung in the air. Retreat was a public admission of failure that would put the entire battle group at risk. Waiting for an attack we couldn't see was suicide. For a long, agonizing moment, Admiral Thompson just stood there, his jaw working silently. He stared at the tactical display, then at me, and finally, his gaze fell upon my son. His eyes were filled with a terrifying mix of fury, disbelief, and the cold, hard pragmatism of a man with no other options. He gave a sharp, angry nod. "Fine," he snapped, his voice a low growl. "You have 2 minutes, boy. 2. Make it work, or I swear you'll be swabbing decks for the rest of this voyage." My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a storm of conflicting emotions. I was terrified for Leo, who now bore the weight of a 5,000-person crew and the wrath of a 4-star admiral on his small shoulders. I was mortified that my son's strange talent had been exposed in such a brutal, unforgiving arena. Yet beneath the fear, a tiny, defiant spark of pride ignited. I had seen him do this before, in our garage, coaxing life back into broken machines, with nothing but his hands and his strange intuition. I met my son's eyes across the room, and for the first time that night, I wasn't trying to silence him. I was praying he was right. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Show them," I thought. "Show them all." Leo didn't flinch. He just gave the Admiral a single, solemn nod and walked toward the power distribution panel. The 2 minutes started the second his feet moved. The air in the CIC grew even thicker, if that was possible. You could feel the collective disbelief of every person in that room. The engineers, my team, exchanged looks that ranged from pity to outright contempt. They saw a child about to play with a billion-dollar piece of military hardware. I saw my son, walking into the lion's den with nothing but a strange, unexplainable sense of certainty. My hands were clenched so tight, my knuckles were white. I wanted to scream, to pull him back, to protect him from the inevitable failure and the humiliation that would follow, but I also saw the focus in his eyes, a look I knew well from our garage at home. It was the look of a master craftsman about to begin his work. He reached the panel, a grey, unassuming metal box covered in warning labels and status lights that were all stubbornly dark. He ignored the diagnostic ports, the access latches, and the complex array of switches that my team had spent hours testing. Instead, he did something so simple, so profoundly out of place in that high-tech environment, that it felt almost sacred. He placed his palms flat against the cold steel surface, spreading his fingers wide. He didn't press or prod, he just rested them there, as if he were trying to feel the pulse of a living creature. A few of the younger technicians snickered quietly, whispering to each other. I heard one of them mutter, "What's he gonna do? Heal it with his mind?" The disrespect was a physical blow, but Leo seemed completely oblivious to it, lost in his own silent world. Then he closed his eyes. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. The only sounds were the creak of the ship's hull fighting the storm outside and the low, steady hum of the backup generators. The 2-minute countdown felt like an eternity and a split second all at once. I knew what he was doing, or at least I had a vague idea. He was listening to the machine's song, searching for the one note that was out of key. He described it to me once as feeling a buzzing or a shakiness in the current, a texture that was wrong. To everyone else, he was a child with his eyes closed, wasting precious time. To me, he was a surgeon performing an impossible diagnosis, and the silence from the Admiral meant the clock was still ticking, each second a hammer blow of pressure. A minute had passed. The silence was finally broken by Commander Evans. He couldn't take it anymore. His professional pride, shattered by our collective failure, manifested as pure frustration. "Admiral, this is ridiculous," he said, his voice sharp and loud, making several people jump. "We are wasting critical time. The boy is just standing there. We need to prep for a full system reboot, even if it takes hours." He took a step towards Leo, his hand outstretched, ready to pull my son away from the panel himself. It was a direct challenge to the Admiral's temporary, desperate command. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my body tensing to move between them, to protect Leo, not just from the humiliation, but from the physical intervention of a grown man who had lost his composure under pressure. The entire room held its breath, waiting to see who would break first. Admiral Thompson didn't move. He didn't bark an order or reprimand. Evans, for a terrifying second, he just watched the commander approach my son, his face an unreadable mask of stone. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was a man of protocol, and Evans was his top naval engineer, the voice of reason, of the manual. Leo was an anomaly, a risk. I could see the internal battle raging on the Admiral's face. Abandon this insane long shot and revert to procedure, or let the final seconds of his absurd gamble play out. My own heart was in my throat. I had to trust that the Admiral's desperation was stronger than his training. If he sided with Evans, it was over. The chance would be lost, and my son would be branded a fool. The weight of that single moment felt heavier than the entire aircraft carrier. Just as Commander Evans's fingers were about to touch Leo's shoulder, my son spoke. His eyes were still closed. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but it cut through the tension like a laser. "It's the K7 crystal oscillator in the primary frequency converter," he said, the words clear and precise. "There's a hairline fracture. It's causing a sympathetic resonance at 1.21 gigahertz. The vibration is creating a phase cancellation wave. You have to bypass the main regulator and reroute the auxiliary power through the secondary bus." He paused for a breath. "And invert the polarity." The sheer technical specificity of the statement was staggering. It wasn't a child's fantasy anymore. It was a complex, actionable diagnosis that sounded utterly insane, yet terrifyingly plausible. The CIC went from tense silence to stunned silence. Commander Evans froze mid-step, his hand hovering in the air. The snickering stopped instantly. The engineers stared at Leo, then at each other, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning shock. "Invert the polarity," one of my own guys whispered, his voice full of awe and terror. "That would trip every breaker on the ship. It would cause a catastrophic overload." But another, the young, petty officer who had spoken up for Leo, was already frantically typing at a console, pulling up the schematic for the frequency converter. He found the K7 module on the diagram, his eyes wide. "Sir," he said to Evans, his voice trembling, "the resonance frequency. It's not in the manual, but the component's theoretical failure point matches that number." The 2-minute deadline was forgotten. A new, terrifying possibility had just entered the room. What if the kid was right? Admiral. Thompson's face was a mask of cold, hard calculation. He looked from the schematic on the petty officer's screen to Commander Evans, whose expression was one of pure, dumbfounded shock. The words "catastrophic overload" hung in the air, a ghost of military protocol warring against this insane last-ditch theory from a child. You could practically see the gears turning in the Admiral's mind. On one hand, every ounce of his training, every regulation he had ever lived by, screamed that this was madness. On the other, the dead screens were a testament to the fact that his training and regulations had already failed him. He was cornered, and in a corner, even a lion will consider a path it would never normally take. His gaze finally settled on Leo, not with anger or sarcasm anymore, but with a terrifying, raw intensity. He was weighing the impossible against the inevitable. "Commander," Admiral Thompson's voice was low, but it carried across the entire CIC, cutting through the stunned. Silence like a blade. "You heard the boy." It wasn't a question. It was a command that defied all logic. Commander Evans flinched as if he'd been struck. "Admiral, you can't be serious. Inverting the polarity on the secondary bus will trip every primary circuit. We could lose backup power, navigation, and everything. It's a textbook definition of what not to do." The Admiral's eyes narrowed to slits. "The textbook got us into this mess, Commander. The textbook has left us blind and sailing towards an ambush. Right now, I'll take the boy's textbook over ours. Execute the command. That is a direct order." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. The decision was made. We were jumping off the cliff, holding on to a 12-year-old's theory. Commander Evans stood frozen for a second, the Admiral's order echoing in the silent room. Then, something shifted in his face. The pride and disbelief were replaced by the grim mask of a professional soldier following an order he fundamentally disagreed with. He turned to the young petty officer, whose hands were already hovering over the console. "You heard him, Miller," Evans said, his voice strained but steady. "Bypass the main regulator. Prepare to reroute auxiliary power." He then pointed to another technician. "Isolate the primary bus. If this goes wrong, I want to contain the surge to the CIC." There was a frantic, yet controlled flurry of activity. Men were moving with a purpose they hadn't had for hours, but it was the purpose of men walking towards a firing squad, their faces pale and their movements stiff with the fear of what they were about to unleash on their own ship. I watched them, my own breath caught in my throat. My hands were shaking, not from the cold of the CIC, but from a terrifying cocktail of fear and a wild, irrational hope. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell them to stop, to grab Leo and run before they fried the entire electrical grid of a nuclear carrier based on his feeling. But another, stronger part of me was rooted to the spot, mesmerized. I looked over at Leo. He hadn't moved. He stood by the panel, his expression serene, as if he were simply waiting for a train that he knew was on time. The contrast was jarring. A room full of the world's best technicians, sweating under the pressure of executing his command, while he stood there with the unshakable calm of someone who had already seen the future. In that moment, I let go of my fear and simply trusted in him. I had no other choice. The petty officer, Miller, took a deep, shaky breath, his fingers poised over the physical control panel for the power distribution unit. This wasn't a software command. This was a hard reroute. He had to manually throw a series of heavy-duty breakers in a sequence that went against every safety protocol. "Bypassing primary regulator, now," he announced, his voice tight. The first breaker went down with a loud, ominous thunk. A new, higher-pitched hum filled the room. "Rerouting auxiliary power to secondary bus, now." Another thunk echoed, louder this time. The lights in the CIC flickered violently. A few people gasped. "Preparing to invert polarity on my mark," Miller said, his eyes glued to a voltage meter that was starting to climb rapidly into the red. 3, 2, 1. His hand moved towards the final forbidden switch. Just as his fingers made contact, a piercing alarm blared through the CIC. A bright red light began flashing on the main engineering console. "Overload, overload, cascade failure imminent," a computerized voice repeated mechanically. One of the senior engineers yelled, "He was wrong! It's frying the whole system! Abort! Abort now!" Panic erupted. Miller's hand recoiled from the switch, as if he'd been burned. Commander Evans lunged towards the emergency shutdown button, his face a mask of "I told you so" terror. This was it, the moment of catastrophic failure. The gamble had been lost, and we were about to pay the price. The Admiral's face went white, his hand flying up to give the order to shut it all down, to save what was left of his ship from the consequences of his own insane decision. "No! Wait!" Leo's voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't a shout, but it had a strange authority that made everyone freeze, even the Admiral with his hand raised. Leo's eyes were wide open now, fixed on the flashing red light. "It's the overload that's fixing it. The system was out of balance. The surge is forcing the fractured crystal to resonate at the correct frequency. It's like setting a broken bone. It has to hurt before it heals. Give it 5 more seconds." His words were so counterintuitive, so completely against every instinct for self-preservation, yet delivered with such utter certainty. The Admiral, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions, stared at my son, then at the screaming alarms. He slowly lowered his hand. "Hold your positions," he commanded, his voice a strained whisper. "Give the boy his—" 5 seconds. The entire room held its breath as the alarm continued to shriek. The 5 seconds the Admiral granted felt like a lifetime suspended in hell. The overload alarm shrieked relentlessly, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. The red emergency light pulsed rhythmically, painting the strained faces of the crew in demonic flashes of crimson. I could smell ozone, the sharp, electric scent of a system burning itself out from the inside. Commander Evans stood frozen, his face a mask of pure, vindicated dread, while my own engineers looked on with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a countdown to catastrophe. Through it all, I kept my eyes on Leo. He was an island of impossible calm in a sea of controlled chaos, his serene expression the only thing holding my own panic at bay. 1 second passed, then 2. The alarm's pitch climbed higher, becoming more frantic, more desperate. The ship itself seemed to groan under the strain, a deep, unsettling vibration that resonated up from the deck plates, a physical manifestation of the violence we were inflicting on its electronic soul. I saw the Admiral grip the back of a command chair, his knuckles turning bone white. I could see the weight of his decision crushing him. His ship, his crew, his entire career, all of it was balanced on the razor's edge of a 12-year-old's impossible theory. The air was thick with the silent, screaming question on everyone's mind. What had he done? He had bet the lives of 5,000 men on a miracle, and the devil was coming to collect. At the 3-second mark, the main lights in the CIC flickered violently and then died, plunging us into an abyss of near-total darkness. The only illumination came from the hellish red pulse of the emergency light. A collective gasp sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. It was the sound of hope dying. This was it, the ultimate failure. We hadn't just failed to fix the radar. We had destroyed the ship's entire power grid. "I told you," Commander Evans whispered into the suffocating darkness, his voice cracking with a mixture of despair and bitter vindication. "I told you." A heavy, final silence followed, broken only by the robotic chant of the alarm. It was the silence of a tomb. Then, at 4 seconds, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the alarm or the groaning hull. It was a low, deep, resonant hum, starting so quietly, it was more of a feeling than a sound. But it grew steadily in volume and purity. It was the clean, powerful thrum of a perfectly balanced machine. As this new frequency filled the space, the shrieking alarm sputtered and died, choked into silence. The pulsing red light went out. For a breathtaking moment, we were suspended in pure darkness and this perfect resonant sound. Then, an auxiliary screen on a nearby console flickered to life, glowing with the steady green of a system booting up. Then another, and another. It was the sound and the sight of a machine being reborn from its own ashes. On the 5th second, the main lights flooded the CIC, not flickering, but shining with a bright, unwavering stability. Every single head in the room snapped towards the massive tactical display wall. The screen, which had been a black mirror reflecting our failure, blinked once. A grid pattern materialized, Lines of data began streaming across its surface at incredible speed. The deep hum settled into a perfect, rhythmic pulse, the steady, powerful heartbeat of a healthy radar system. Commander Evans was staring, his mouth hanging open, his face a perfect picture of dumbfounded shock. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. We were witnessing an impossible resurrection, and we were all terrified to break the spell. The screen resolved into a crystal-clear, high-fidelity map of the surrounding ocean, but it wasn't empty. There, less than 50 nautical miles away, positioned with lethal precision in the blind spot, we had been sailing through for hours, were 3 bright red icons. They were moving in a classic pincer formation, a wolf pack closing in for the kill. The IFF system confirmed our worst fears instantly. 3 hostile destroyers, fully armed and preparing to launch an attack. The ambush wasn't a theory anymore, it was real, it was imminent, and we had been sailing directly into its jaws, deaf, dumb, and blind. The silent, cold reality of our near extinction washed over the room with the force of a physical blow. A new kind of silence fell over the Combat Information Center. It was not the silence of tension or of failure. It was the profound, deafening silence of absolute shock. The only sound was the perfect, steady hum of the radar system that had just pulled us back from the brink of oblivion. Every sailor, every officer, every engineer was frozen, their eyes locked on the screen that displayed the death that had been stalking them moments before. Admiral Thompson slowly, mechanically turned his head. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. He looked away from the enemy ships, away from the proof of his near-fatal mistake, and his gaze landed on my son. Leo was still standing calmly by the panel, his hand now resting lightly on its surface, as if he were comforting an old friend. Admiral Thompson was the first to break the spell. His voice, when it came, was not the booming command of before, but a low, rough sound, as if it had been scraped raw. "Battle stations," he ordered, his eyes still locked on Leo. "Target acquisition. Prepare countermeasures." The words were automatic, the product of decades of training, but his focus was entirely on my son. He didn't thank him, not then. He couldn't. The magnitude of what had just happened was too vast for simple words. Instead, he gave Leo a single, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of approval. It was a nod of concession, of acknowledgement. It was the silent, stunned admission of a man who had just witnessed the impossible, a king bowing his head, not to a child, but to the undeniable truth that had just saved them all from annihilation. The CIC exploded into a symphony of controlled, lethal efficiency. The panic was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of professionals who finally had a target. "Sir, destroyers are launching torpedoes," an officer called out. "Evasive maneuvers, full starboard rudder, launch countermeasures," the Admiral roared, his command voice fully returned. But now it was fueled by the adrenaline of survival, not the frustration of failure. I watched as our carrier group, once a blind giant stumbling towards a trap, transformed into a coordinated weapon of immense power. The screens lit up with tactical overlays, showing our fighters scrambling from the deck, and our own defensive systems locking onto the incoming threats. We were saved, and the raw, terrifying beauty of that response was a direct result of the quiet boy still standing by. The humming panel. Hours later, after the threat was neutralized and the enemy fleet was in full retreat, the storm outside had calmed. The CIC was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Admiral Thompson walked across the room, past his command staff, past the exhausted but victorious technicians, and stopped directly in front of Leo. He didn't tower over him. He crouched down, bringing himself eye level with my son. The entire room watched. "I have never," the Admiral began, his voice low and devoid of all its earlier arrogance, "been so wrong in my entire life. Your name is Leo, isn't it?" Leo just nodded. The Admiral reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass coin, pressing it into Leo's hand. "That is my command coin. It is given for excellence above and beyond the call of duty. There is no one on this ship who deserves it more." I stood there watching, and the last of my fear and shame finally washed away, replaced by a feeling so profound it almost brought me to my knees. It was awe. I had always known Leo was different, that his connection to machines was special, a quirky hobby I encouraged, but I had never truly understood the depth of it. I had seen it as something to be managed, even hidden, in the real world. In that moment, watching a four-star Admiral honor my son, I realized I had been the one who was blind. His gift wasn't a hobby, it was a language, a form of genius that I, his own father, had been too conventional to fully grasp. I wasn't just proud of him for what he did. I was humbled by who he was, and I felt a pang of guilt for ever trying to make him be anything else. The next day, Leo was no longer a ghost on the ship. He was a legend. The crew members would fall silent when he walked by, not with suspicion, but with a kind of reverence. Commander Evans, the man who had tried to shoo him away like a stray cat, approached me in the mess hall. He didn't apologize directly. His pride wouldn't allow it. But he looked me in the eye and said, "Your son, he hears things we can't. He's a true engineer." Later, the Admiral presented Leo with a custom-made ID card. It read, "Leo Caldwell, Chief Engineer's Apprentice, with Level 5 security clearance." It was an official recognition, a formal decree that this boy, who was once an outsider, now belonged to the very heart of the ship. He was no longer a passenger. He was part of the crew. On that day, in the steel heart of a warship lost at sea, a crew of seasoned warriors learned a lesson that no manual could ever teach. They learned that the most powerful tools are not always forged from metal, and that true life-saving clarity can come from a voice that everyone else has been trained to ignore. The Admiral's coin never left Leo's pocket, a constant heavy reminder of the day his strange, quiet truth outshouted the roar of an entire navy. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most critical perspective comes from the one person in the room that no one thought to ask. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-belief, please share this story with them. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. The story of that day became more than just a legend aboard the USS Vigilance. It became a part of its operating system. The tale of the boy who tuned the radar was told to every new recruit who stepped into the CIC. It served as a constant, humbling reminder that the most advanced systems in the world are still subject to truths that can't be found in a manual. Admiral Thompson, a man forged in the rigid certainty of military protocol, was visibly changed. He started asking more questions and listening with an intensity he hadn't shown before. He learned that true command wasn't just about giving orders, but about recognizing the right answer, no matter how improbable the source. The ship was saved not by its billion-dollar technology, but by the moment its commander chose to abandon certainty and embrace a desperate, childish faith. My relationship with my son was fundamentally reforged in the crucible of that crisis. Before that day, I saw my job as a father to be a shield, to protect Leo's gentle, unusual nature from a world that wouldn't understand it. I was wrong. My job wasn't to shield him, but to be his translator, to help the world see the genius I had always privately known. The shame I felt when the Admiral first scoffed at him was replaced by a fierce, protective pride. I learned that my greatest failure wasn't my team's inability to fix the radar, but my own initial instinct to silence my son. I finally understood that being a parent isn't about molding a child to fit the world, but about fighting for a world that has space for the unique shape of your child. Leo, for his part, remained Leo. He didn't become arrogant or outspoken. The event didn't transform him into a different person. It simply affirmed who he already was. The Admiral's command coin, which he carried everywhere, wasn't a medal he polished, but a key. It was his license to be himself without apology. He found a home in the humming, greasy heart of the ship's engineering decks. The hardened veteran sailors, men who had once dismissed him, started seeking him out. "Hey, Leo," they'd say quietly, "the number 3 coolant pump has a weird shake to it. What do you hear?" He wasn't a child or a mascot anymore. He was a peer, a fellow craftsman, a boy who spoke a language the machines understood, and they had finally learned to listen. Ultimately, this story isn't just about my son or a broken radar on a stormy sea. It's a testament to a universal truth we too often forget, that expertise can become a prison and authority can be a blindfold. We build our worlds on rules, protocols, and hierarchies, and we become so confident in their structures that we dismiss anything that exists outside of them. We trust the diagnostic report over the quiet voice of intuition. The greatest breakthroughs, the moments that save us from the ambushes we can't see, often come from the perspective we are most conditioned to ignore. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about having all the answers, but about having the humility to listen to the one person who sees the world differently. On that day, in the steel heart of the ocean, a crew of seasoned warriors learned that the most powerful weapons are not always made of metal, and that true clarity can come from a voice everyone else was trained to ignore. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-belief, please share this story with them. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening.